Hello, and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today we're continuing our debate review series, which is a series that is hotly requested on this channel. A lot of people ask me in the comments to do more debate reviews, so that's exactly what I'm doing. I've decided to do around one debate review every single week. That means I'll do verse of the days from Monday to Saturday, and on Sundays I would do debate reviews and perhaps do another review somewhere if there's an interesting or a debate that I want to cover right after the debate that I see. So basically, with that small admin or context out of the way, let us get into this debate review. And the debate review that we're reviewing today is a debate between William Lane Craig and Eric Wielenberg, and hopefully I didn't butcher the name, but essentially this debate is on the grounding of objective moral standards. The question is, and of course in debates the question is very precise and very important, is that what is the best account of the objectivity of moral values? So before we enter this debate, or before we talk more about the actual interaction between these two debaters, I would like to first go into some background knowledge about these two positions and kind of give you an overview of who they are and what they do. So essentially, William Lane Craig is commonly regarded as one of the best Christian debaters or apologists in the business because, if you watch his debates, he's very smooth and his presentation skills in a debate are almost perfect because he grew up in the debate team and is really good at a debate. So if you want to learn more about debate or how to debate, whether it's about religion or anything else in general, you could always just check out a William Lane Craig debate. And the debate skills are very important, especially in a debate, because, well, the knowledge is one thing, preparation only gets you so far, but your presentation skills is indeed the most important thing at the end of the day, because you can sometimes see a guy who's really good at debate but not really good at the knowledge completely run or defeat someone who's really knowledgeable but not prepared for a debate, well, just because they don't really know how to present themselves or prepare for the timing and rigid structure of a debate, which is generally not found in a discussion. So that is why I love Craig, and I think Craig is one of the best apologists, because not only is he good at the philosophy, he's also good at debate and could also teach you a lot about debate. I do quite a lot of debate as well in my school, and I like to use the William Lane Craig format, and his format has actually inspired a lot of my approach to debates and made me one of the better debaters in our school. So essentially, that's a bit of the background of Craig. Craig's basically, since he's a Christian, is going to argue that objectivity of morals are grounded in God and not from an atheistic standpoint. Eric Wielenberg, on the other hand, is presenting the idea that God is not the best explanation for morals, rather it is something which he calls Godless normative realism, which is a sense of forms, or a realist approach to morality, where it says that there exists these transcendent or abstract forms which interact with us to give us understanding of moral knowledge. And this is kind of quite an old Platonic idea, or kind of an old idea, where there is a form of the good which is represented or transferred to reality and to our lives, which then allows us to interact and know what is good and evil. So while there is objective morals, that of the form, it is indeed godless, as the name suggests, godless normative realism. So with that idea out of the way, let us go into Craig's opening statement, and you can note how Craig opens it, and I'll just give some also debate suggestions and debate recommendations as well, kind of how you structure a debate, just if you're interested in that as well, because Craig always does this really well, and I think it's a good way to approach any debate. So first of all, he does a lot of signposting, and signposting is basically the idea that you lay out or you structure your approach very clearly at the start, and you say, I'll start off with saying this, then I'll discuss this, and I'll discuss this. So you have a clear signpost about what you're going to do. And Craig starts off by saying, okay, theism provides a sound grounding for objective morality. And then he says, after I discuss this, I will then discuss why atheism does not provide a sound grounding for objective morality. So from the get-go, he already signposts exactly what he's talking about. He sets the scene for what exactly the debate is talking about, and after he sets it, he says, well, this is what I am defending. So with that in mind, it then turns to this, he then dives deeper into his first statement, or his first thesis, which is basically theism provides a sound grounding for objective morality. Then he says theism provides a sound grounding for objective moral values. And this is essentially a general restatement or a very similar premise to his argument, which he basically says, well, these morals are grounded in God because God, as the greatest possible being, is by definition good. So here we can see is that he's not only just giving us, he's saying, well, the argument for God being the grounding for objective morality is the most parsimonious or the most simple approach, which fits Occam's razor. It also is an analytic definition, or it is a idea that God by nature is good, and not God because of something else is good, but it's by his own nature, his intrinsic nature, which also refers or responds to a very common argument against the Christian morality, which is the Euthyphro dilemma, which basically says, is it pious because it is godly, or is it pious because it's loved by the gods? Something along those lines. So essentially, he's saying that it's the most simple explanation, God being the grounding for objective morality, and that is the first argument he raises. And then he raises a second argument, which is, well, theism provides a sound foundation for moral duty. So not only does it provide a sound foundation for moral values, like what the rules are, it also provides the ought. So there's a common discussion in the philosophy of ethics, which is the is-ought discussion. Even if you find the is, the rule, you may not find the ought, which is obligation. Why should you do it? Even if perhaps on evolution or Darwinism, perhaps maybe reproduction is the ultimate goal. There's no obligation to reproduce, if you got what I mean. While it is good to reproduce, there might not be an obligation to reproduce. So there's a difference between what is good and what you ought to do. Because it's perhaps the case, or one can make the argument, that these things are good, but at the same time we ought to do what is not good, and then you have an is-ought skip here. But then what Craig is saying is that, well, is and ought, in this case when it comes to God, is that not only is it what is good, but it also provides moral obligation, the ought as well. And he basically says, well, God's commands provide objective duties. By commanding something, God decides or makes X and Y objectively good, but also obligatory. That means we must follow God's rules. And this is essentially the divine command theory approach to ethics, which is basically saying that God's commands are what are good, and God's commands are what you should do. And before I move on to his second approach, the second thesis, that atheism does not provide a good sounding for objective morality, I would like to give a quick reminder that I am going to be talking with a natural moral law ethicist who is going to discuss natural moral law on this channel next Monday, February 22nd at 8 p.m. Hong Kong time and 12 p.m. or 12 p.m. UK time. So if you are looking forward to that, or you want to discuss objective moral laws or see objective moral laws, make sure you stay tuned for that. You could find a live stream on my homepage on this channel, so you can go check that out and put that into your calendar. So that where we will discuss natural moral law along with some other objections and some different discussions. So with that out of the way, let us start discussing Wielenberg's Godless Normative Realism, and this essentially follows his second line of attack, because if you remember, he signposted at the beginning two theses. Theism provides a sound grounding for objective morality. He discussed that just now. And then he discussed atheism does not provide a sound grounding for objective morality. So there's a separation here. So now he's talking about the second one. He says, well, his first argument against atheism, or Wielenberg's Godless Normative Realism, is that godless objective morals cannot come from social conditioning or evolution. So this is essentially a common argument against all forms of atheistic morals, since, as you can see, if everything just came from randomness, there cannot be an objective rule. There might be certain facts, but there's no obligation to it because everything's random, and there's no way to see why one view is superior to another. For example, if we had utilitarianism and you had utilitarianism and some other deontological morals or some objective morals, they would all be equal and they're both random, so you cannot choose one over the other objectively. It would be a subjective choice. So that's one approach. And there's also the idea that, well, he's arguing that Wielenberg is suggesting that we need a transcendent realm of moral values to ground these objective moral values. And that's what Wielenberg does with his godless normative realism. He's saying, well, he's saying that Platonic realism, as I've discussed before, is a grounding for objective moral reasoning. So if there's a certain command like killing people is wrong, there will be a consistent or a correspondent Platonic form or an idea or an abstract concept which would correspond with this law to make it objectively wrong. And here Craig looks at that and says, well, Platonism, or this form of godless normative realism, is more extreme than theism. And by Occam's razor, we should see that we should suppose or turn to the most simple explanation, which is theism, and not commit ourselves to this wide expanse or existence of Platonic forms. Furthermore, he talks about this separation between concrete and abstract objects. This is the idea in Van Inwagen's idea that, well, abstract objects should be very far from concrete objects because one is some sense of forms, whereas concrete objects are actually existed in reality. So we have a bit of suggestions as well. We have the separation between the abstract and the concrete, and I've discussed this in a bit more depth in my live stream I did the other day on implications of the infinity, so if you want to check that out, make sure you go do that. So the idea, a concrete object, God, is more plausible than an abstract object of Platonism, because what Craig is saying, well, God, although it's not substantiated in physical reality, is closer related to reality due to causal relationships and things like that, which make God closer and more similar to physical reality than abstract objects when compared to physical reality. So there's a separation between the distance between God and abstract objects and reality. So since abstract objects are really far separated, we should accept God as closer, and God is a better explanation. So that is his first argument against Wielenberg's approach. His second argument is the idea that the interaction between abstract moral properties with physical objects is implausible. And this is the idea that there's a separation between transcendent forms and man. This separation making it very difficult because it's very difficult for the physical to reach out to the abstract. And what Craig means by this, I think, is to say, well, it's very difficult for humans to reach out to these transcendent forms because this connection isn't very explicit. For example, there's chairs, right? And we normally say, or Platonists might say, well, there's a form of the chair which makes all chairs similar. And then how do we interact directly between us and such a form? Because we clearly cannot interact or experience the form of the chair, we only experience chairs around us, an imperfect idea of the chair. Furthermore, there is further problems with the idea of us reaching out to these abstract forms, because if we could, then it just makes it really weird why not all of us realize or interact and understand the same forms of morals, because a lot of us, and there's a lot of debates between atheistic morals and different approaches to morals, like abortion. So unless there's a form or we can interact with these forms, it just seems very weird why we'll have so many differences about these discussions if we do not have a direct connection, or if we did have a direct connection to these abstract forms. Because if we did have a connection to the same objective standards, then it seems that we should all have a similar understanding of moral values. So it doesn't seem that this connection between human understanding and abstract object or abstract moral forms is there. It seems more of a detachment, or even if they exist, it doesn't seem that we have any connection to it, which makes it even harder to argue that they exist at all, because if we have no connection to them, how do we know that they exist? So that is a further problem with godless normative realism. Furthermore, William Lane Craig raises a problem of the is-ought problem. He says, well, even if these realism ideas exist, even if these forms exist, well, where's the obligation for us to follow them? Maybe it is true that these forms exist. It is good not to kill people. However, it doesn't follow that we ought not to kill people. There is no obligation to choose to follow these forms. It is just an objective moral standard, although there is no obligation to follow this objective moral standard. Furthermore, William Lane Craig then discussed the the freedom of the will, which is essentially a discussion on epiphenomenalism, which is the idea of the causal closure of the physical, which suggests that the mind and the body are separated. And I'm no expert on epiphenomenalism. I actually tried to read some books on it, and it just blew my mind, and I didn't really want to go too far in depth into this school of thought. But essentially, I'll summarize it quite quickly for you with my limited understanding of this field. And it's basically the idea that, well, the only physical causal states is the causation from the physical to the mental, instead of the mental to the physical. So our brains do not have that much dependency, or our brains are separated from our physical states. So our brains could think one thing, but what our actions are is something else. And since there is this separation, what happens to our physical body, our actions, our freedom of the will, does things. We do not have a freedom of the will, because our brain may have some freedom, or our brain might be thinking, but our body is not correspondent to that brain. So there is no duty, because our body is doing things which are not controlled by our conscious or our thoughts. So there is a separation here. And you could build onto this, and sorry, my Discord might be going off, but essentially you could build on this by suggesting that Dostoevsky, who discusses the idea of the freedom of the will and the laws of nature, and suggests that, okay, I'm going to turn off my Discord, it's getting a bit loud here, but essentially what I'm going to say here is the idea that, well, since there are mental states, or since there are, how do I say that? So essentially, you could build on this by turning to Dostoevsky's approach, by saying, well, if the laws of nature are all that they are, then all things are permissible. We lose all sense of moral duties. And since the mind and the physical are separated, then we don't have freedom of the will, and we are in some sense determined, losing all moral responsibility for any of our actions, which seems to get rid of moral obligation, duty, and accountability. Furthermore, and this is the final argument that William Lane Craig raises, is the idea of Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. Since everything is evolutionary, our brain is pointed towards survivability and not truth. And on this assumption, we soon realize that, well, moral knowledge would be impossible, because moral knowledge is based on our cognitive faculties, which are moved towards, or directed towards survivability and not the truth. So our moral knowledge itself would also be directed towards survivability and not the truth. So there is also a problem here. So now let us talk about Wielenberg's opening and Wielenberg's response. So Wielenberg basically says, well, there is an objective reality with good and evil. Things are wrong intrinsically within themselves, and I think this is the idea that Craig and Wielenberg would share. And furthermore, building on the concrete and the abstract distinction, Wielenberg then raises that, well, physical beings and non-physical beings should also be impossible, in the sense that they're also very separate. So he's saying that the separation between the concrete and the abstract is a similar separation if you turn to the physical and the non-physical. And then he questions God's divine command theory, which says, if God commands X, you have powerful reason to do X. But then, well, why should you follow this theory? Why must God be good and exist in every possible universe? How do these properties always interact in the same way? And I think, basically, I'm reading on my notes here, but basically what I'm trying to say is that, well, God's commands do not need to be true, or he's arguing that, well, why should we accept that God is necessarily good? And then he then argues that that morality does not only require God's commandments, but it can also be dependent on other factors. And these other factors could be, well, perhaps a situation, some situational ethics, and these other ideas, which may influence moral decisions and not stem from God's commands. And the second objection, well, would be the idea that people need to be aware of commands and aware of the commanders. Because since a lot of people do not recognize the existence of God, or do not understand the existence of God, for example, perhaps they're suffering from some form of psychopathy, something, I can't pronounce it, but something along those lines. If they do not have direct connection with their moral knowledge, then the problem rises that, well, they do not have knowledge of this moral understanding, and hence they cannot be held obligatory, or they do not have moral obligation because they do not even know it, because a lot of people do not have direct understanding with the moral laws. So, and I think this is a very powerful or very interesting remark. However, I don't think it fully defeats the argument that Craig raises, because Craig, even if, so let's go through each of these arguments then. Let's go first to his argument of objection 1, the idea that morality doesn't only require God's commandments. Well, what William Lane Craig suggests is that divine command theory doesn't mean that all morals are accounted, or doesn't mean that God provides answers or direct commandments for every single moral act. However, what God does do is provide general themes from which we can abstract or take moral remarks from, so there's a separation here. Another thing that he responds to the objection to the idea that people need to be aware of both the commander and the commanded, or the command itself, is that God has written the law on people's hearts. That means even if we do not directly know God, we have an intrinsic knowledge of what is right and wrong. And I think that's true, because if you turn to the Hindus, you turn to Christians, you turn to atheists, we all have a similar understanding of moral judgments. Not the entire broad all of moral judgments, but at least the general specifics. We should be nice to each other, we should be kind, we should help each other out when someone's in need, we should not kill each other. Like, these basic overall judgments are indeed written on our hearts, and that's what seems like it. So it seems that both Wielenberg's objections are indeed answered. So I wouldn't go too far into this video or discuss any further. If you're interested in watching the entire debate, I'll link it in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, like always, make sure you like and subscribe. It will help my channel grow. And also, if you want to request any more debate reviews or anything you want me to cover on my channel, make sure you join the Discord server, which would be in the description, and let me know your thoughts. Any feedback on that server is accepted. Let me know what you like and what you want me to do more on this channel. Like always, have a great day, stay safe, God bless, and goodbye. Thank you very much.